Any further questions from committee members? We've got one person signed up to speak for the bill, Joshua Silverstein. Sir, if you would, just identify yourself to the committee, and then you're recognized to give your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and representatives. My name is Josh Silverstein. I'm a professor at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, William H. Bowen School of Law, but I'm speaking exclusively in my individual capacity, not on behalf of the university. So as the chair said, I'm here to speak today in favor of HJR 1011, and I want to begin, before I go into my prepared remarks, about something that Representative Pilkington said about how both the left and the right think that our Constitution, and frankly all state constitutions, get amended too often. Representative Pilkington is a Republican. I think most of you know I'm a liberal Democrat, and yet I'm here supporting his resolution, so just to show the truth in his point. The United States and every individual state within our union are democracies. And a fundamental principle of democracy is that the majority is entitled to govern in most areas of public policy simply because it's the majority. This means that decisions concerning legislation, whether voted on by elected representatives or by the citizenry, normally should be decided by majority rule. But this country and the states are not just democracies, they're constitutional democracies. And the essence of constitutionalism is that certain principles of fundamental importance are enshrined in the Constitution and placed beyond the reach of regular political majorities. Some of those principles relate to the structure of government, such as separation of powers or an independent judiciary, and others concern individual rights, such as the freedom of speech, the free exercise of religion, and the right to bear arms. Because constitutions are intended to serve as paramount laws beyond the control of majorities, only a supermajority should be authorized to amend a constitution. In other words, changing our form of government and eliminating or adding to our individual rights ought to require a supermajority. If a mere majority has the power to alter the structure of government established by the Constitution, then the political system can become unstable. And if a simple majority may remove constitutional rights, then those rights are not actually fundamental. Former judge and constitutional scholar Robert Bork explained constitutionalism in this way. Constitutions are supermajoritarian checks on transient majorities. To elaborate, political majorities come and go, parties obtain and lose power in Washington, Little Rock, and other capitals. And the views of the population on matters of public policy are constantly shifting. That's what's meant by the phrase transient majorities. According to Bork, in a constitutional democracy, the supermajority establishes a constitution to A, create a sphere of authority for ever-changing majorities, B, create a sphere of individual rights shielded from majority rule, and C, establish courts that preserve the boundaries separating the two spheres. To be sure, the boundary can be altered, constitutions can be amended, but only the supermajority is entitled to make such a change. Only when a supermajority consents to an amendment can we consistently trust that the change to our structure of government or our fundamental rights is warranted. This reasoning justifies a vote in favor of HJR 1011, which will install supermajoritarianism in the Arkansas Constitution and explains why countries across the globe have been moving towards American-style constitutional democracy over the last century, rather than embracing other systems such as pure democracy, where all laws are subject to majority rule. Now, some critics of proposals like HJR 11 claim that such a change permits minority rule, because under Representative Pilkington's proposal, 34% of voters will be able to block an amendment favored by the other 66%. But remember, the very purpose of a constitution is to establish by supermajoritarian consensus the structure of government and our fundamental rights. As a result, a minority should have the power to stop a mere majority from altering the Constitution. For example, 34% of Arkansans ought to be able to prevent 66% of Arkansans from stripping away the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, or the right to bear arms in the Arkansas Constitution. As Representative Pilkington noted, HJR 1011 avoids the pitfalls of Issue 2 from the 2022 ballot and many other past comparable reforms, in that it only raises the threshold for passage for constitutional amendments, not legislation. That's critical. Raising the threshold for legislation above a majority is generally inconsistent with our democratic ideals, and HJR 1011 only applies to constitutional amendments. I also like the other addition that Representative Pilkington put in the resolution, which cuts the number of amendments the legislature may refer to the people from 3 to 2. That's a positive change. It's difficult for regular citizens to keep up with all the candidates running for office, whether they be judges or otherwise, let alone all of the issues on the ballot during elections. That's especially true when a measure is many pages, as many measures often are. So basically, I think it is critical that we bring the Arkansas Constitution into alignment with the core features of constitutionalism by making the document harder to amend, and thus I support HJR 1011. When I spoke about what became issue 2 years ago, one of the questions I received was, where should the supermajority line be? Should it be 55, 60, 66, 70? I think that's a matter of a judgment call. I don't think there's a clear answer as to where we should draw the supermajority line. My gut would be 60% because it's the people voting rather than the 2/3 that is required in Congress to get an amendment before the states. But I think 66% works really well. I think you'd go as high as 70. Any higher than that, the Constitution becomes too hard to amend. Any less than 55, you don't really have a supermajority requirement. So anywhere in that range, it's a judgment call. I respect Representative Pilkington's judgment that 66 is the way to go, and I support that. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any question from committee members? Seeing none, Mr. Silverstein, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Representative Pilkington, you're recognized to close.
Thank you, Chairman Tosh.
Do you have witnesses? Okay, yeah. You're going to be here anyway? Okay. What number is this? Representative Meeks, I believe you have a couple of bills on the agenda, but I believe you're here on 1628. Is that correct?
The non-compete bill, correct.
Yes, sir, that's 1628. And my understanding is your other bill, you're not going to pursue that one. Is that correct?
No, 1588 has been withdrawn, so
Thank you.
that one is become toxic for various reasons, so no, we won't be pursuing that.
Thank you. So 1588 is going to be withdrawn, members. Representative Meeks, you're recognized to proceed on 1628.
All right, thank you. So Representative Stephen Meeks, District 42. With me, I have Mr. Silverstein. I'll let him introduce himself real quick.
My name is Josh Silverstein. I'm a professor at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, William H. Bowen School of Law, but I'm here only in my individual capacity. I'm not speaking on behalf of the university.
All right. Committee, so this bill was brought to me by a constituent who unfortunately found himself in a situation where he feels that he's been trapped by a non-compete clause. He works in an industry that is we'll just say it's a very small industry. And everybody within that industry requires a non-compete law. So you can't enter this profession in this state generally unless there's a non-compete clause. And what that non-compete clause does is it locks you in to that employer. You almost become an indentured servant. And the only opportunity that you have to improve your place in your career, or if you are in a hostile work environment, the employees that find themselves in the situation, the only opportunity they have to get out from underneath that is to leave the state or to go somewhere else. And if you have a family, you've developed your whole life in the community, you're a pillar of the community, it's not fair to put you in a situation where you're deciding between I'm stuck here in what is potentially a hostile work environment, or I'm stuck here and I can't improve my work conditions to compete to go somewhere else because I'm under this contract. And so what this bill does is it tries in the very best possible way to meet the concerns of businesses within our state, but also to protect the rights of the individual. And the way the bill does that, and I'll just briefly go through it, most of it's on page 4. what it says is that we're basically going to be getting rid of non-compete clauses. However, non-solicitation agreements still remain in effect. Confidentiality agreements remain in effect. The employee is not going to take your job secrets and take it to a competitor. Covenants are prohibited, or trade secrets or inventions, we already talked about that. Covenant entered into by a person purchasing or selling the goodwill of a business or otherwise acquiring or disposition of an ownership interest. The individual who shifts cannot actively solicit the customers from the old business. So, for example, if I'm in sales, I can't go to a competitor and solicit those customers. I can't learn all the trade secrets of being a property manager and then from my current employer and then go out and start my own business and solicit those customers that I had. You have to go after us. So this is a fair way to give these employees the opportunities to improve their situation while also at the same time trying to protect those business interests that I know need to be protected. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mr. Silverstein.
Covenants not to compete, or non-competes for short, pit two fundamental American values against each other: freedom of contract and competition. That's why all states at least regulate such provisions more heavily than nearly all other types of contract clauses, and in many cases they ban or largely restrict non-competes. The antitrust laws that we have in this country actually flow out of the historical common law governing covenants not to compete. They adopted many of the same principles into the Sherman Antitrust Act that were contained in the common law rules governing non-compete clauses in the 19th century. Now, many employers in Arkansas and generally require prospective or current employees to sign a non-compete to gain employment or remain employed. And employers regularly require non-compete clauses solely to restrain competition in the employment market rather than to protect the various legitimate business interests that Representative Meeks explained, such as trade secrets and genuinely confidential information. Many employers include these restrictive covenants, as they're also called, simply to create a disincentive for their employees to try to leave. They know the clauses are not enforceable. For example, certain food delivery services that have no confidential information at all are requiring their delivery people to sign non-compete clauses. Those clauses are clearly unenforceable, but most of those employees subject to those non-competes don't have the resources to hire an attorney to challenge the clause. Non-compete clauses critically harm our labor markets. They make it much harder for businesses to hire people, and we know how difficult it is right now for employers to hire folks, and they make it harder for consumers to use their provider of choice, because if they want to purchase from someone subject to a non-compete, they often can't do so. Many states enforce non-competes in many fewer circumstances than Arkansas, including Colorado, Idaho, Illinois, Louisiana, Maine, Maryland, New Hampshire, Oregon, Rhode Island, Virginia, and Washington. And states from across the spectrum politically have actually banned or almost entirely banned non-competes, including Oklahoma and North Dakota on the right and California on the left, yet those states have vibrant, flourishing economies. And so Arkansas does not need non-compete clauses to have a well-functioning, dynamic economy. Now, there are two main counter-arguments for why we need to keep non-competes. The first is that it encourages employers to invest in their employees. But this isn't supported by the bulk of the empirical evidence, and the fact that so many states have limited or banned non-competes and not had trouble with their employers investing in their employees shows that this is just not a concern we need to worry about. The other argument is freedom of contract. Doesn't banning non-competes restrict freedom of contract? But there are all sorts of contracts that we limit, and the most important type of contract we limit are those that restrict competition. That is what the antitrust laws are designed to do, to restrict contracts with the principal purpose of limiting competition, which is unfortunately what large numbers of non-competes do. And what ends up happening then is we hurt our labor markets, we hurt employers who are trying to find employees, we hurt competition, and we restrict consumer choice. And so I support this bill strongly because I believe it strikes the right balance in limiting non-competes, but preserving things like non-solicitation clauses and trade secret protections that give employers the genuine protections they need while not giving them the power over our labor markets and over their own competitors that they have when they can have non-compete clauses. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
And just one final point that I'll make. By getting rid of our non-compete, and this bill was modeled after the legislation in Oklahoma, so Oklahoma has successfully passed this. By getting rid of the non-competes, what we do is we encourage businesses within our state to compete for that talent that they have, to develop stronger workplaces, to try to attract and to keep the talent that they have, and also to try to attract talent from other states. This is an opportunity to help us bring talent to Arkansas and not force our talent to leave to go somewhere else simply because of these non-competes. So with that, we will open it up to any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Representative. Questions by the committee? Representative Ferguson, you're recognized for a question.
Sorry. Typically, these non-competes, don't they have a geographic component? What would be a typical geographic limitation on these non-competes?
So it's generally probably going to depend on what the industry is, on what those are. They can generally, so for example, if in the news media, it might be that news media market. If it's a sales position or a chef, for example, at an executive restaurant, it may be a 50-mile or 100-mile geographic. But generally, it's going to be to the extent that if they want to switch employment, they're going to have to move. They won't be able to continue in that field and still live in the same spot where they live practically.
That's the critical point, is that they're generally broad enough that people would have to leave where they currently live, and that makes the geographic range effectively infinite because most people don't want to or have the resources to leave where they're living.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I had a non-compete when I hired an associate at my dental office, and I remember the attorney telling me that really beyond a mile or two, it was not enforceable. So maybe rather than not allowing them, is there some way to limit the geographic reach of them? I don't know. I'm just asking questions.
Okay.
I thought she was just musing on that. And then that gets into kind of this arbitrary situation, and then you start picking winners and losers. If we say nobody within 5 miles of that business, well, then the employees of that business who live within 5 miles suddenly can't, and the ones who are outside of that can. So it can create a...
So in the states that allow non-competes, there generally is a restriction on how broad the geographic range can be. The problem is that in the states that have non-competes, the range is always large enough that it effectively makes it impossible for employees to work. We could narrow it a lot more and make it just a couple of miles perhaps, but as the representative said, that would still be a huge problem for most people, and employers don't really want non-competes in those circumstances anyway, so we're kind of stuck. Either we're going to have them or we're not.
Is there someone to testify against this, or?
Yes, there is.
Oh, yeah, I'll ask them then.
Representative Lundstrom, you're recognized.
Just a couple of questions. First of all, a contract is a consensual agreement between two groups, correct? And so I'm a little confused. We have Northwest Arkansas, which has some of the largest companies like Walmart and all Vendorville and Tyson and Simmons, and they have all kinds of people coming in and vying to go to work for these companies. So I have a hard time believing that a non-compete contract is keeping anybody from coming to Arkansas and keeping anybody out. This bill is, to me, almost frightening that we would get in the middle between a consensual contract agreement between a business and an employer. When an employer is making a tremendous amount of investment to bring in somebody and to hire good talent, why are we doing this? I'm at complete loss.
Well, I think we've explained it. And if an employee signs a non-compete, that non-compete is generally in effect for the full time that they're there. And while the conditions may have been great the first 6 months, what happens if management changes and now all of a sudden things aren't so great there?
Contracts are renewed, and that's why we have attorneys. That's why you renew a contract, and these are not unsophisticated folks. If you go into these fields, they're professionals, and they understand a contract when they go into it. They negotiate these contracts, and usually this type of person is somebody that's making $100,000 a year, and this is a pretty big deal.
Sure.
But we're interfering with somebody's lives and people's businesses and negotiating contracts this is going to have some long-term implications. I'm just concerned. We'll stop there and let other people ask questions.
Representative Lundstrom.
Well, I'm sorry. If you don't mind, we're going to continue to move. I think you'll have time to interject. Representative Allen, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand non-compete clauses. Many years ago, I went to work for a pharmaceutical company. They invested a lot of money in me in training. They invested airline tickets in me. They sent me to some of the best schools around, and I was very knowledgeable of their product. And before I went to work for them, I had to sign a non-compete agreement. It was on the front end. Not only did they show it to me once, twice, but it was 3 times in the contract. So when an employee enters into those type of agreements, there's no hidden agenda.
Sure. Don't dispute that.
It's on the front end. So I can't understand why we're doing this when it's clear. It'd be different if it was in a little small hidden words in a paragraph or buried in a bill or buried in a contract, but it's not like that. So, they know on the front end that you signed a non-compete agreement. And I signed that agreement. And I expected to honor that agreement because they gave me an opportunity to work for their company. Now, for me to come back and violate that, that's a violation of my integrity, and it's also a violation of what my contract called for me to do. Wouldn't you agree?
So just a couple points there. Companies, I've obviously worked for companies over the year, and they've invested that kind of stuff in me as well without a non-compete. So that's a non-compete or non-compete. And there are employers or there are employees who, in certain fields, they can't get a job unless they sign one of these non-competes. And
let me say that. I couldn't get the job either unless I signed it. I agreed to sign it. I agreed to the terms of the contract.
Sure.
So if you agreed to the terms of the contract, wouldn't you agree you should honor the contract?
I don't disagree with that.
Okay, thank you.
The question is, though, should you be forced to sign that contract in order to get a job? Because that's the position these employees are, that's the position these people are being put in, is if I want to get a job in this field, I have to sign one of these. And then they're trapped in that.
Just one follow-up, one comment.
You're recognized. Let's try to move this along, though, if we can.
But I agreed to do it. So when people agree to do it, they agree to do it. Am I correct?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay,
Sure.
thank you.
Thank you. Representative Rose, you're recognized.
Yes, and I think Representative Lundstrom and Representative Allen kind of honed in on where I was going, but 2 questions. The first one is, are you seeing a large number of employees being deceived into signing non-compete clauses?
So I don't know that they're being deceived on the front end. The question is, so twofold.
Sorry, Representative Meeks, I don't mean to cut you off, but that's just what I wanted to know first. And I've got a follow-up, but I'll let you kind of expand on from there.
So no, I don't think they're being deceived into these. I think in some cases they're being forced into these because of the field they've chosen to go into, and the only way they can get employed is to you either sign one of these or you just don't work in that field because of that limitation.
So what I'll say is I'm almost the opposite of what Representative Allen's situation was I had a couple different job opportunities that would have required me to sign non-compete clauses. And ultimately, I decided to not take those jobs because I didn't like that. And I ended up actually taking lesser job at the time. And I kind of defer back to, I hear the words you say is that they're forced into this decision, but it is not a gun to the head situation.
No, that's true.
They are willfully deciding to enter into a contractual agreement. And so I come back to, why do we need to change what a consenting adult and either another or a company have agreed to? Why do we need to do that if they're choosing to?
Because of the reasons I've given. Because you're trapping them in that position. I mean, I can flip the question around. Why do these companies want the non-compete? As he just said, most of the time there's not like company secrets. They're doing it because they want to keep that employee there, which I understand, but they want to keep them there not because they're offering them good benefits or a great job environment. They're wanting to keep them there so that they don't have to compete with other opportunities.
Representative Meeks, I'm sorry to cut. We're still in the question and answer phase. You'll have an opportunity to close for your bill. I know. I think we can. Let's move this along if we can. And I didn't mean to cut you off, but and let's try not to be repetitive if we can. Representative Richardson, I think you were recognized. You were next.
Yes, sir. Thank you. It's my understanding that most non-competes come with an expiration. Would you agree?
I'm sorry. He's going to have to.
I have class in 20 minutes, so I got to leave in about 1 minute. My apologies.
Okay.
I'm sorry. So can you repeat your question, please?
It's my understanding when you sign a non-compete, there's an expiration date of that non-compete. Would you agree?
Most non-competes do have a 1 or 2 year limit.
So if that's the case, an individual who signs a non-compete, they're not happy with it, they don't have to move, they just can't move in that industry for a year or two, correct?
So in other words, they're not employed for a year.
Possibly.
That's the situation. So for example,
Okay. That's it. That's all I needed. Thank you.
Actually, excuse me, I'm sorry. I actually have a question for the professor, if you wouldn't mind. Just a clarification for me. My understanding right now is Arkansas is what we call a blue pencil state. Is that correct?
Correct.
On non-compete. So what that means is any non-compete that's entered into, a judge has the ability to come in and say, no, that was overly burdensome, that's too onerous, and I'm going to modify it and make it fit the situation. Is that your understanding?
That's essentially correct, yes, sir.
Thank you. That was my question.
I'll just say that's one of the biggest problems, though, is that it encourages employers to draw as broad a provision as they want, knowing the worst case scenario is they'll still get a provision that they're reasonably happy with, and they know that most people won't sue anyway. So the blue pencil provisions actually create bad incentives for the drafters of non-competes to overextend the clause, knowing that most people won't sue, knowing worst case scenario, they'll still get a reasonable restriction anyway.
Thank you.
I gotta run now, okay.
Representative Brown, you recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's been quite a
We are hearing constitutional amendments today.
No, it's the highway department, 15, I think.
If you would just introduce, both of you guys introduce yourselves and you're recognized.
Okay, and I think there's some other people who want to testify for this bill. I'm Senator Brian King, District 28.
My name is Josh Silverstein. I'm a professor of law at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock William H. Bowen School of Law, but I'm here only in my individual capacity. I'm not testifying on behalf of the school.
Thank you, Senator. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. Former Representative Dan, Republican Representative Dan Greenberg, many of you that's been around know Dan very well and how brilliant he is. And so I've had a long relationship with Dan, and this is something that we've have been very passionate about for several years, well, actually maybe even some decades. But the constitutional amendment in SJR 1 would reform our redistricting process for the state legislature. Currently, our redistricting process is under the control of the governor, attorney general, and the secretary of state. This proposal is that each of the 3 officials could appoint 3 representatives, then produce a redistricting plan for the state legislature. One important part of this proposal was to follow new rules and standards as to be neutral as possible. Everyone in Arkansas has an interest in neutral and nonpartisan redistricting. I think that we all know that there is a possibility that outside groups over the next couple of years are going to try to amend the Constitution with their own redistricting proposal. I've seen redistricting proposals that I thought were not crafted as liking as I would like, and I have seen redistricting proposals that I thought were maybe more slanted. One reason I propose this measure is to give a better redistricting plan so we can resist possibly bad redistricting plans or ones that we may not be the best interest of Arkansas. I want to say something about the timing of redistricting. The next redistricting is going to take place about 8 years from now. That's 4 election cycles in the future. It's very difficult for us to determine where we will be in 8 years from now. That is why redistricting reform should be done now, and so we cannot and will not take our personal interests into account. If it becomes harder and harder to avoid taking personal interest in account, this is one of the several reasons that if we delay action, we are more likely to face a proposal in election on a districting plan from an outside group. I don't think it's necessary for me to walk through all 8 pages of the bill, but I would draw your attention to proposed section 8, starting page 6. The section describes the factors the commission would have to use to draw the line. Then it describes the factors that the commission would be prohibited using. This is the heart of proposal. So with that, I'll turn it over to
Thank you, Chairman and Senators. As Senator King just explained, SJR 1 would create an independent districting commission. Creating such a commission would substantially immunize state elections from the deeply harmful practice of political gerrymandering. The United States elects most legislators via single-member districts. Those districts are typically created by elected officials. The traditional criteria for drawing such districts include equalizing the population of each district, which is required by the U.S. Constitution, respecting city and county borders, contiguity, which is just a fancy word meaning all parts of a district have to be connected, and compactness, meaning districts should have simple shapes that keep all parts of the district close together. Now, gerrymandering is the process of creating districts to advantage a particular group in an election rather than focusing primarily on traditional districting criteria. And political or partisan gerrymandering occurs when boundaries are drawn to aid a political party. Gerrymandering undermines the right to vote by making it more difficult for some citizens to elect officials that represent their views. Under political gerrymandering, the votes of the minority party have less weight in elections. Now, the purpose of elections is for voters to select their representatives, but gerrymandering constitutes representatives selecting their voters. Government officials decide which subsets of the population may vote in which races, partly or largely mooting elections. Now, voting is a fundamental right under both the U.S. and Arkansas constitutions, but partisan gerrymandering undermines this right based on a person's political affiliation, making gerrymandering inconsistent with the democratic principles embedded in our federal and state constitutions. Imagine if a law was adopted providing that Republicans must pay 20% more in taxes than Democrats, or that Democrats are only entitled to free speech 6 days of the week rather than 7. Or that Republicans are only allowed 6 jurors when charged with a crime, whereas Democrats are entitled to 12. Such discrimination on the basis of party is precisely what gerrymandering does. Political gerrymandering is equivalent to a law providing that minority party votes are only worth 90, 70, or even 50% of majority party votes. Now, gerrymandering has a long history in this country, but it's reached epidemic proportions in the last 2 decades because of advances in computers and data collection, which makes it easier to draw districts that maximize the advantage of one party. Consider just 2 examples. In 2016, only 33 of the 435 positions in the federal House of Representatives were decided by a margin of under 10%. All of the remaining House races were landslides, where the result was essentially dictated before anyone had cast a single ballot. The average margin of victory in Congress that year was 37.1%, a figure more consistent with elections in Russia and North Korea than in a democracy like ours. In 2020, my other example, there were 12 competitive congressional districts in Texas. But after redistricting, there were a mere 2. Only 2 out of 38 Texas House races in 2022 were decided by less than 10%. Uncompetitive districts reduce or eliminate incentives for elected officials to compromise with the other side because the greatest threat to their job is from within their own party, namely a primary challenge. Deep red and blue districts also reduce turnout. Why vote if the result is ordained by the district map? Political gridlock and the deep frustration most Americans have with our political system are heavily driven by gerrymandering. It is thus not surprising that polls consistently find that the vast majority of Americans of every political stripe strongly oppose the practice. Now, how do we eliminate gerrymandering? We bar the fox from guarding the henhouse. We remove politicians from the process of creating their own electoral districts. And that's exactly what Senator King's proposed constitutional amendment would do. The commission, under his amendment, is charged with creating legislative districts for the state, house, and senate using only traditional districting criteria. And SJR 1 expressly bars the commission from considering political factors, such as data about partisan affiliation and the impact of new boundaries on incumbent legislators. Multiple American states from across the political spectrum employ independent commissions, including Alaska, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Michigan, Montana, New York, and Washington. And the same is true in other countries with established democracies that elect officials via single-member districts, such as the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, India, and Mexico. If independent districting commissions work in all those places, there's no question such a commission will be successful in Arkansas. Thank you very much.
Let me add, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, so been involved in politics for, at least for over 30 years, and so I've seen gerrymandering and redistricting happen on all sides, and it's just a process to try and make an independent and fair decision. If we cannot make an independent and fair decision on how the lines are drawn, then how do we expect the process to go right for after that? So with that, we take any question. I know there's some other people who want to testify pretty quickly for the bill.
Go ahead, Senator Flowers.
So, if the Board of Apportionment right now is the governor, Secretary of State, and the AG, and they're going to choose 3 individuals each under this proposed bill, what's to say that they won't use politics in their selection of the 3 choices that they have?
So the amendment specifically identifies certain criteria for who can serve on the commission. There has to be 1 lawyer, there has to be 1 person with expertise in mapping science. But most importantly, what the amendment says is who cannot serve. Anyone who's been involved in politics over the last couple of years. And after you serve on the commission, you're restricted from participating in campaigns or donating to politicians for a few years after you leave. Now, I think you're right, Senator Flowers. One thing I didn't say in my initial remarks is no process will completely remove politics. That's an impossibility. We're humans, we're flawed. There's going to be some politics. But what the independent districting commissions have been shown to do, both in other states and internationally, is reduce the level of politics. And so at the very least, this proposal will be a significant improvement. It won't be perfect. Nothing can be perfect in this context.
Next question I have concerns how the population shift in Arkansas has become, so that South Arkansas has fewer residents. So I'm just trying to visualize how is that going to make a big difference. I'm from Southeast Arkansas. I have parts of, I think, 6 counties now, and I guess the last 2, well, I think I've been here for 3 redistricting measures, And each time, my district just gets larger. So how does that benefit?
Well,
I mean, I think Arkansas is kind of unusual like that. Maybe parts of Texas, you have large areas, but Texas has more population. I don't know if you said they have an independent commission. I don't think they do. But I think you gave some examples, and they just went over my head. I don't know what states you mentioned. But how do you get a resolve where the population shifts so much?
a couple of things. First, to reiterate, the states were Alaska, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Michigan, Montana, New York, and Washington. And I'll start with your last question first. Basically, every state in the United States has urban areas, rural areas, and exurban areas that are kind of between those two. And those populations are always shifting. You're exactly right, Senator. The Supreme Court has ruled, correctly in my view, that the 14th Amendment requires that every person get equal vote. This is the long-standing phrase, one person, one vote. So as population shifts every 10 years, states are obligated by the Constitution to redraw districts to deal with those changes. And these types of shifts are happening in all 50 states. So Arkansas is actually not different in this respect from any of the states I just identified. Now, one of the things you noted that's really important is that you're in a more rural area, so you have multiple counties. And so the idea of respecting political boundaries isn't as important in your district, perhaps, as it might be in some other places where there's a fewer number of representatives representing the counties. And so the idea is we want to try to respect political borders, but that's only one factor among many. We're going to try to look at keeping the shapes close together, keeping the shapes connected to each other. And so all of those factors are put together, and the Independent Commission tries to balance all of those concerns. So we have no choice but to redo the districts every 10 years. We have to, under Supreme Court understanding of the Constitution. What this amendment does is try to make it so that when we do that, it's the fairest possible.
If you look at page 6, there are some things that they're supposed to, population equality, any applicable federal civil rights laws, avoiding the division of cities and counties. In 2011, when redistricting happened, the small town of Alpena, which has about 300 people, because of gerrymandering, had 3 state senators and 2 state representatives. So, you know, that's what we did in this law. And Representative Greenberg, we can get you in touch with him. He can give you some better answers too, because he's the primary author of this bill. You know, one thing it also does is the communication part. I mean, right now, there can be a lot of verbal communication. If you look at page 6 on line 5, if a member of the commission or a member of the commission staff receives verbal communication on how the state should be reapportioned for senators, representative, both senators and representative, the member of staff shall document the communication in writing. So those people drawing the map are going to have everything documented that people can see. There will be no verbal communication that you go in there and say, hey, I want my district drawn for this or that. So I think Representative Greenberg and then the professor here, you know, kind of outlined that. But, you know, we outlined things that cities and counties should be kept together as much as possible.
Senator Dodson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You said something in your testimony. I found it here on page 5, lines 12 through 15, where you said that one of these individuals appointed to the commission would be prohibited from participating in, contributing to a campaign, running for state or federal elected office during his or, wait a second, is that the wrong right line? Anyway, bottom line, prohibition, how does that, I guess in your mind, how is that not violating their free speech rights under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution? Seems to be in direct conflict to me.
Well, remember that constitutional rights can be waived, and there are all sorts of circumstances in which people surrender portions of their constitutional rights for some purpose. People who join the military do, people who serve in the civil service do in many contexts. So this is actually reasonably consistent with our long-standing practice of putting people in positions that need to be nonpartisan. Judges generally are prohibited from speaking out on political issues, even though that's a core First Amendment speech, and yet judges give up that right as well, essentially, when they join the judiciary. So this is consistent with all of those different examples.
We also passed a 2-year ban on lobbying. I mean, there's some other things. I mean, he mentioned about the judges, current, Supreme Court justices. They can attend meetings, but they can't make political contributions. So we already have that in the state in some areas.
That's probably violates their First Amendment rights as well, but.
Well, they're judges, so I would think they would be raising questions about that. So, but Mr. Chairman, we're just hearing testimony today, correct? So I mean, I will step out. I know there's some other people want to testify. I know we got some others and if anybody has any questions, and then.
Any questions from the committee?
And I think somebody else wants to speak, but Representative Greenberg will be available and to discuss with each one of you about this. He's the primary author, so.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have 2 to speak for the. So introduce yourself again and you're recognized.
Again, my name is Josh Silverstein. I'm a professor of law at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock William H. Bowen School of Law, but I'm here only in my individual capacity. I'm not testifying on behalf of the school. I will be much briefer this time because Senator Clark did a masterful job explaining the benefits of his proposal. There are 2 primary reasons to support an open primary like this, and each goes to a fundamental aspect of our democracy. First, open primaries better reflect the will of the voter. And second, they generally result in better government, and I'll talk to Senator Payton's point about the evidence. On the first point, jungle primaries better reflect the will of the voters because they encourage more people to vote in primaries. They permit crossover voting, and they allow people to pick among all of the candidates in deciding who to vote for. So I'll go to an example of why, say, an independent should like this proposal. During the primary, the independent has to decide, and most Americans are now independent, do I want to vote in the Democrat primary or the Republican primary? It's a tough decision to make, but in an open primary, they don't have to pick. They get to participate in everything altogether. And so let's assume we're dealing, as we usually are in Arkansas, with red districts where 2 Republicans are going to make it through. The independent voter actually will prefer that situation as well, because they get to vote in the primary and maybe vote Democrat if they lean a little to the left. And then when the general election comes, they get to choose among the 2 top Republicans. They get to decide which of the Republicans they think is best, whereas with a closed primary, they don't get that choice. They don't only get to pick one party or the other to vote in the primary, and then in the general, they're stuck between the 2 extremes, which they often don't like. So I think that that's one of the real advantages. Now, when it comes to the second issue about whether it creates better government, I've done some looking at the literature, and in fairness to you, Senator Payton, and as an academic, I always try to be as objective as I can. The evidence isn't that strong that it has decreased partisanship. Part of the reason I think that is because it's so new and people aren't really used to the system yet. I think it's starting to have some positive impacts in California. It's going a little bit slower than we would like, but I think things are moving in the right direction. And I think in the long run, open primaries like this will reduce partisanship in those states. They've started to do it a little, not as much as someone like me would have hoped, but it is moving in that direction. And so I think it will work out well, especially in the long run. That's really all I have, unless there are questions from any of you.
Thank you, sir. You want to close?
I'll just add on.
Josh Silverstein. I'm a professor of law at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock William H. Bowen School of Law, but I'm only here speaking in my individual capacity, not for the university. SJR 6 makes 2 changes to the law of sovereign immunity. First, it eliminates sovereign immunity for the state of Arkansas and all of its instrumentalities in cases involving constitutional rights. Second, it permits the state legislature to waive sovereign immunity for any other type of claim. Before explaining why this would be an extremely positive change, let me briefly note what SJR 6 does not do. It does not address the immunities of individuals or corporations that are acting on behalf of the state. Sovereign immunity is a holdover from the era when most countries were monarchies. The legal basis for sovereign immunity was as follows. Because the monarch created the courts, the monarch is superior to the courts, and thus the monarch is not subject to the jurisdiction of the courts. But the United States is not a monarchy, nor are any of the individual states, including Arkansas. The courts in this country do not owe their existence to a king, the legislature, or the executive. Instead, the courts are co-equal branch of government created by the federal and state constitutions. Accordingly, the historical basis for sovereign immunity no longer exists. Moreover, there are no persuasive modern policy justifications for sovereign immunity. In fact, sovereign immunity is fundamentally incompatible with the rule of law, due process of law, and the concept of a Bill of Rights. Modern societies use litigation to resolve disputes and vindicate rights. If a human being is injured by someone else, or one of their contracts is breached, that human may sue in court for damages. If a corporation or partnership or a nonprofit or some other artificial entity either injures you or is injured, they may sue in court to recover for damages. But if the state of Arkansas or some division of the state, such as a commission or university, injures you or breaches a contract with you, you cannot sue in court to recover your damages. Instead, you're consigned to the Claims Commission and then ultimately the legislature itself. There's a fundamental principle of American law that states that no person should be a judge in his or her own case. But that is exactly what happens when a person sues the state of Arkansas for money. The legislature itself, which is at the apex of our state government, ultimately decides if the injured person is entitled to relief from the government. That is inconsistent with the principles of due process that underlie our justice system. It means that sovereign immunity makes it far harder for citizens to enforce their fundamental legal rights, such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to keep and bear arms. To make this analysis somewhat more concrete, consider this hypothetical. Suppose an Arkansas citizen enters into a contract with the state of Arkansas and with the nation of Germany for the provision of business services here in Arkansas. Suppose further that Arkansas and Germany both default on their contractual obligations. The citizen could sue Germany in Arkansas State Court because of the commercial activities exception to the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. But to cover for the breach of contract by Arkansas, the citizen would have to resort to the Claims Commission. In other words, current law makes it easier for a citizen of this state to sue a foreign country in Arkansas State Court than to sue the state of Arkansas itself. I submit that simply does not make sense. Sovereign immunity has no place in a modern constitutional democracy like Arkansas or the United States. And the United Kingdom, which is the source of the American doctrine of sovereign immunity, eliminated such immunity in 1947. A number of American states have also either eliminated sovereign immunity in whole or limited it in part, especially in the area of tort actions. So let me briefly address two counter-arguments to SJR 6. The first is that it will increase litigation. But that's a feature, not a bug. As I said, litigation is how we resolve disputes. It's perhaps the most important mechanism for protecting fundamental rights and keeping the government in check. The alternative is simply that rights can be violated with impunity. There should be more litigation against the state, because right now there's none. The second argument against weakening sovereign immunity is that it will hold the citizens of this state financially responsible for the wrongdoing of their governor. Or the government. But once again, that's a feature, not a bug. In a constitutional democracy, government officials represent and are chosen by the people. This means that all public employees are agents of the citizens of this state. Another fundamental principle of American law is that if an agent commits a wrong, the principal is responsible. SJR 6 extends this concept to wrongdoing committed by government officials that violate constitutional rights, and it permits the legislature, at its discretion, to extend the concept in other contexts, such as with statutory rights. If a state official injures a person or breaches a contract on behalf of the state, rectifying that wrong should come out of the taxes that every Arkansan pays. Moreover, Holding all government officials responsible, including me as a professor at a public university, creates incentives for Arkansans to more carefully monitor our government. If we see too much wrongdoing resulting in litigation, we can vote to change our elected officials to reduce such wrongdoing. In fact, limiting sovereign immunity will almost certainly save Arkansans money because the threat of litigation will greatly decrease wrongdoing by the state, wrongdoing that causes significant financial harm to both the immediate victims and society at large. To wrap up, litigation is the primary tool for enforcing legal rights. Thus, litigation should be fully available to challenge state wrongdoing, just as it is available to challenge private wrongdoing. Whether you're a conservative, liberal, or somewhere in between, you almost certainly believe in government accountability. Limiting sovereign immunity will help to bring about greater accountability for our government using the best tool ever created to enforce legal rights, lawsuits before independent courts. And as always, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Are we not a representative republic united by a constitution ratified by independent states?
Yes.
Together with independent citizens?
Yes.
So sovereign immunity, you said, is ancient?
Correct.
Is your individuality ancient?
It is.
Is our independent states ancient?
They are.
Are we still?
Well, not ancient, more really the last 300 years would be the
Are we
better
still
way.
a representative republic?
We are.
We're just getting older, right?
We are.
So in this, we are self-governed, true?
Absolutely.
So these protections are like me suing myself is what I consider sovereign immunity. Whenever you're self-governed, that's what you're doing.
Not exactly, because we operate in multiple capacities. Sometimes we act as citizens in a governmental capacity where we're electing representatives or donating to making campaign contributions. But other times we're dealing with the state in a commercial capacity where we might do business with the state, or we might not even have a relationship with the state at all, but get into a car accident with a state official. And so when we're operating in those other contexts, that is where sovereign immunity creates its problems. And most importantly, the reason why SJR 6 is written to absolutely eliminate sovereign immunity with constitutional rights is it's in those contexts where it's the citizen acting as an individual against the state. And so in those contexts, an individual suing the state, it's protecting their individual rights when the state is hurting them as individuals, not as an indirect part of the government.
So is the individual a part of the state?
When they are paying taxes, yes. But when their freedom of speech is being violated or their property rights are being violated, definitely not.
All right, thank you. Are there any other questions? Seeing none, appreciate your testimony. You want to close your bill?